Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Corey Pierce, Marketing Director at ChurnZero, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar titled From Zero to 100, How to Scale Customer Support and Customer Success at Your Startup. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that we are recording this session. A link to the recording will be available 24 hours after this webinar. Throughout the presentation, you are welcome to submit your questions via the question and answer box, and our staff will try and answer them as we go. We will also address as many questions as we can during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Now I'm pleased to introduce to you today our presenter, Michael Redbord, who is the Vice President and General Manager of the Service Hub at HubSpot. At HubSpot, Michael worked directly with customers for over a year as an inbound marketing consultant, then built out the HubSpot Academy team to provide online education for the whole HubSpot customer base. Following that, he moved into an operational role in the customer success team, establishing better analytics and process for the support, consulting, and account management teams. Today, he's going to share his hard-earned lessons of growing the customer support and customer success functions at HubSpot and how they started from a team of 1 to a global team of over 250. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Corey. That was an awesome introduction. I'm really psyched to be here today with all you guys on the webinar. And huge thanks to ChurnZero for putting this on and inviting me. I'm really excited to share some kind of candid findings and learnings from that story Corey just told you. So, like Corey said, my name is Mike Redbord, and nowadays I'm the General Manager of Service Hub product at HubSpot. So that means I'm a VP of product at a 2,500 person public SaaS company, right? But as you heard before, that's not how my job always worked. And really, I consider my tradecraft to be a support tradecraft, a customer tradecraft, not a product one. And when I started working at HubSpot, a SaaS company that sells software to small, medium-sized businesses. At the time, we were under 100 people, and we were growing pretty quickly. And my job was really just to take all those new customers that were coming along and onboard them, get them set up, and support them throughout their journey with our product. I think I had actually onboarded like 10% of our entire customer base at some point way back in the day, about 9 years ago when I started here. So then, through that journey of growth at HubSpot, I was basically the person that built a lot of our functions out. You heard Corey mention before the HubSpot Academy, which is our online customer and education sort of department, and then further to that, ran our support team for about 3 or 4 years, and then eventually ran our whole customer operation, right, for about 5 years there. So I had kind of a big hand in scaling what we did for customer success at HubSpot, and that was, look, through multiple funding rounds, product changes, product launches, international expansions, multilingual, an IPO, and among a bunch of other chapters. And the point of sharing that backstory with you guys here was just to communicate that, like, during those years and a lot of the findings from the story I'm about to tell you, it was a really kind of intense period of growth and change. And we learned a lot here at the business at HubSpot, and I learned a lot personally. If I'm being really honest, though, I think most of what I learned was actually what not to do, and then how to iterate my way to success pretty quickly. So today's webinar, I hope, is a pretty candid compilation of all the things that I've learned over the years while scaling support and success at a pretty kind of hyper growth company of HubSpot from under 100 people to now 2,500 today, a $5 or $6 billion company that we are now. So let's dive in. I'm going to use this type of kind of look, a few points in this presentation. So I just want to give you guys kind of a housekeeping note on this. You see the chart goes up and to the right, right? That's the story of growth that we all want. And I've divided this into basically 5 different stages, okay? Founding, early, mid, growth, and scale. I'm going to kind of try to benchmark for you sort of different things that happen at different stages. And I'm going to use certain pieces of language in there around like, oh, when you're founding, maybe you're, 0 to 5 employees, or when you're a mid-sized company, you're 100 to 200 employees. Every business kind of changes and develops differently. The hope is that as we talk about each one of these stages and some of the do's and don'ts, some of the learnings that we've had at each of these stages, you guys can kind of find bits and pieces of it in there that match the way your business works. Not every business will scale perfectly with a number of employees. Not every business will scale perfectly with revenue, right? It's sort of a matter of like, over time, businesses tend to encounter similar challenges, and similar categories of solutions tend to work better, earlier stage than late stage. So we're going to break this up into some pretty discrete chunks in today's webinar, but I just wanted to give you that kind of housekeeping note, not to be too kind of penned in on, oh, well, I have 6 employees. That must mean I'm out of the founding stage, because that's not what it's about. All right. So Back in the day, when we were growing the business and we were in those earlier stages, those founding early stages of HubSpot, I was running our support team. The year was 2013, and our model for scaling was something like this. We would bring in a bunch of customers. We had a sales team that signed up pretty much all those customers. And for every some number of customers, this was how we scaled our service team. We'd hire a support rep for every, whatever, 50 customers or something, right? And we had a very, very simple way of doing this. In fact, we prided ourselves in the simplicity back then. We were probably a 150, 200 person company in total, right? And we had maybe, I don't know, 20 people or something like that on the customer team. And we thought, wow, this is really cool. We found a really simple way to grow. We sort of got like the holy grail of, math here. Every time we find 50 more customers, we just hire another person in support. The machine seems to run pretty well. Well, it's not complicated, right? And we had this kind of key ratio, but almost unsurprisingly, this hit the fan pretty quickly once we started to really grow, right? And so this was what my 2013 looked like, especially in the first half. Things just didn't scale along with the business. Q1 of 2013 at HubSpot was one of those really dark times in software that, people, if you survive it, they talk about them like, oh yeah, those were just the dark days, right? Well, these were our dark days, and a lot of it was because we couldn't scale our support and success functions correctly. We ended up with about a 3x increase in churn. Still today, when we look back on this era in our big charts of revenue retention and company growth, there's a big divot here back in 2013. And it was just kind of a really, really messy time from a business standpoint because we failed to scale what was happening in our support and success operations. As a result, it was a pretty angry time. A lot of customers were really, really unhappy with the level of service that we were providing them. And it took us about 4 months to recover. I remember we sort of entered this bad time sometime in around, I don't know, like early December of 2012. And it took us all the way till almost April of, like 2013 then to come out of it. And so recovery was not a matter of just, do a couple of things differently, it'll snap back together. We were really in the muck on this for a very, very long time with some really serious business impact when you see that 3x in lost customers. Just to give you one more stat here about what happened when scale didn't work, in my experience, was that we had about a 15-minute average wait time on our phone lines for support in that period of time. People tend to call your support when they really need something, right? They don't always just like email you. When you don't get a response to their email, they start calling you, right? Things begin to escalate. And 15 minutes is pretty awful. What that means is that for every customer that we picked up the phone on, in 1 minute, there was another customer that waited 30 minutes or even longer. And that was just completely unacceptable to our install base of small and medium-sized businesses who, have things to do other than listen to our really bad hold music. So those were definitely the dark days, and what happens when this kind of scale process goes wrong. And frankly, we just learned so much before and after this episode that I think it's worth sharing with you guys here today. So at that point, we were basically somewhere in the middle of this curve, and it wasn't just a support and success crisis. It was actually like a fundamental business crisis that really threatened our existence. So in the next 30 minutes or so, what we'll talk about is all the learnings from those days, things I'd wish we'd done differently, and some do's and don'ts to all of you on how to grow better than we did. And even though nowadays HubSpot's a pretty decent story of success, man, it wasn't always going to be that way. And I think there's just a lot of things we could have done better as we kind of ramped up this curve at every stage so that we never encountered that big angry face as we actually started to kind of climb up that mountain of growth. There's really the one takeaway that I want to give you guys here at the outset, if you have to jump early or something like that. And the single biggest learning that I had in my 5 years of running HubSpot's customer team through that crisis era and then afterwards was it's not as much about how you do what you do or even what you choose to do, the plays that you call. The real key is calling the right play at the right time. It's the when, right? And there's a lot of ideas out there about what really works for customers, what really works for the right way to do success or the right way to do service, right? The real key as a success leader is understanding all of those, all the what's, understanding how they work, all the hows, but then actually making the right call at the right time. That's absolutely the kind of crux of the matter. And we made a lot of calls that were pretty smart, but at the wrong time. So a lot of the do's and don'ts that I'm going to go through here are based off of those learning experiences that we had then. All right, one more quick note on terminology here, just to talk about support and success, because I'm going to use these and just want to make sure we're all on the same page about what I mean in this webinar when I say success versus support. So success, when I use that term, I'm talking about a function for your customers that's primarily proactive, right? You're creating the energy in the system. It's an ongoing engagement, so it doesn't have a terminal point, sort of keeps going along for the life of the customer. And typically the goal of that work is to create some business outcome, to retain a customer, to upsell a customer, right? To expand into some other line of business of theirs, right? That's success. That's on the left here. On the right, we've got support, right? And so support, in contrast, is a primarily reactive function. You're responding to a customer inquiry when they've raised their hand, right? To contrast that, on the success side, you're raising your hand, creating the energy in the system. On the support side, it's primarily transactional, right? So you're sort of, you have a beginning and an end to the interaction. There's an engagement that is terminal, and at some point, you're done, right? Contrast that to success, it's really an ongoing process. There's never really an end. There might be little mini chapters in there, but it's really an ongoing process. And then in support, typically what you're looking to do is have a really good engagement that has a beginning and an end, do it quickly and do it effectively, right? In success, it's kind of a broader goal, right? We're looking for business outcomes, whereas support, you're really looking for engagement level outcomes. So when I use these two terms, just wanted to give you guys sort of the guardrails on those as to what I mean for support and success. All right, so you with me? Let's dive in and let's start with some of the do's and don'ts of truly early stage companies, right? Sort of founding stage when you're like that primordial ooze of a business that's just trying to make everything go, right? So that's really the first one of these, right? You're founding early, mid, growth, and scale. And let's talk about what a business really looks like at this stage. You probably got a set of founders, right? You probably have some pretty involved investors, and you have a few folks kind of maybe building and selling your product, perhaps. And some of those might even be those same founders or investors too. And the whole effort here, right, is around getting the business to kind of get that product market fit, build what customers need, identify who your customers are, and just endeavoring to deliver something that has value to somebody, right? It's a lot of that feeling like you're kind of clawing at the earth to make a turn. And these can be really challenging days all the way on the left here when we talk about the founding stage. At this stage, customers, though, are really just like your lifeblood more than ever for every company. Yes, customers are like one of the most important things that you could spend time thinking about. But when you're so early and your company itself is an experiment, right? The outcomes of that experiment are reflected in your customers. And so getting feedback from those customers, being close to those customers is just of the absolute utmost importance at the founding stage, because any failure to do that, and anything less than 100%, can really kind of kill your company when it's just in these very, very early days. So the question then is, how do you support those customers at this stage of growth? What are some of the things that you need to think about, right? And the answer is that what I see in companies out there that are at this stage is that support and customer involvement is just everybody's job. And look, it might feel like kind of a natural outcome of a small team, right? But that's actually a very, very important point in there. Everyone's working with customers. Customers are everyone's job. Therefore, everyone is really intimately close to customers. That means there's no distinction, there's no functional distinction at a company of this size, right, between support or success, right? That's not even a thing. But further, there's not even a distinction maybe between sales and customer stuff, or even between writing code at a software startup, say, and working with customers, right? People just do what needs to get done, and successful startups, at least, I think everyone develops a pretty instinctual understanding of the customer as a result of this sort of working model, right? So the cool thing when you look at this from a customer standpoint or from a support or success standpoint is it turns out to be an advantage for the business. They learn faster by being able to get faster feedback from customers, which leads to faster iteration on product market fit, right? They build empathy faster, so founding teams tend to see customers and see markets a little differently. The belief here is that a lot of that is actually based off of this chapter when you're so close to your customers. And it's also good for customers too, because they get really kind of, root level access, so to speak, to the team. So it kind of benefits everybody. If you get it right here of how to work with your customers, you get faster product development and a higher touch relationship early on. So an interesting thing when I work with startups or advise them on how to grow is that at this stage, a lot of startups look like this, but simultaneously they want to grow, right? A lot of this is about how do we grow into the future and have more basically orange icons appear, in our org chart. It's a funny thing though, because when that happens, when you start to add in more people, you start to lose that element of support is everybody and everybody works with customers. It's kind of an interesting tension that we'll come back to a few times here, that when you're really small, customer work is everybody's job. As you grow, you start to specialize it, and you actually move a little farther away from your customer in some way. So it's a funny tension in kind of growing a company that I think is actually important to understanding what it means to deliver really good customer success at scale. So when you're this size, here's some do's and don'ts. You'll see this format in a couple of the following slides. Really, the do is just to set up a very simple workflow to manage customer requests, right? I think a lot of companies, you end up with customers that are like, texting you in the middle of the night or reaching out to you in sort of funky ways. That can work for a period of time, but the place you really want to track to, a destination you want to keep in mind, is having some kind of workflow to intake and manage those in some level of consistent way. It'll just kind of start you on a path at this stage that's going to give you a much stronger foundation as you start to do more sophisticated types of customer interaction. Handling everything on your iPhone is sometimes okay as a founder, but it actually doesn't scale very well. Surprise, surprise. Another do, absolutely involve everyone in helping to solve customer problems. Like I said before, I think this is actually a pretty organic process that I see at most successful companies where everybody rallies around the customer. It's an awesome thing to see at those businesses. It's just something to make sure you're doing and breathing every single day, is to involve everyone in helping to solve customer problems when you're at this founding stage. All right, and then third, is to use this support function, use those interactions with your customers, whether it's around, getting them set up on a product, a feature request that they need, a strategy concern that they have about how to use it or how to integrate with the ecosystem. All of those are opportunities to make your product market fit better and to grow a better business. And again, I think small teams tend to be really good at this, especially successful ones that are really focused on that product market fit. The don'ts then are kind of corollaries of the do's, right? One of the don'ts is just not to worry about efficiency. You're going to be inefficient at this stage. You're not going to be able to like rip through tickets at any pace. That's not the goal, right? The goal is to find that product market fit and to use support as a tool to make your product and your experience better. And the other one that I've seen quite a bit, and this is, this goes without saying if you've actually seen this or lived through this, but it's just about like not letting your engineers hack together workarounds that need to be maintained down the road. A lot of times there's ways to solve problems quickly and rickety ways that create really gnarly tech debt. Anytime you do that in a very, very early stage, that debt will grow over time with the growth of your company. And so the earlier you plant that bad seed, the bigger that bad tree eventually grows. And just being very, very regimented about solving problems the right way and having complete solutions that will scale with you, that'll actually work more to your benefit at this founding stage than ever again in the future. All right, so those are some do's and don'ts here. And I think if you're in this type of company, hopefully some of this stuff spoke to you. Or if you're not and you're through this, hopefully you had some rose-colored memories of what this was like back then when maybe you had some simpler times. All right, if we move on forward to the early stage here, right? And that's kind of, I'm using this employee number, 5 to 10 employees, right, as just a way to, sort of benchmark it, right? But if we talk about this early stage, you're now a little bit through that primordial ooze, as I referenced it, phase of the founding era. You started to get a bit of traction, right? And things are kind of starting to catch. It's a really, really good thing for a business because you've got some product market fit and you've probably started to then layer in some new functions in order to grow better. Hopefully the traction in your business model started to give you a little bit of strategy and perspective on exactly how you're going to grow too. From your customer's perspective, which you now have customers, by the way, at this stage, if you're actually starting to grow, things are still pretty raw and frothy though, from like your customer's perspective. Your customers are likely still working with some of the folks that they worked with earlier on. That means founders or people very, very involved in the core of the business, especially if there's a sales question or something that's revenue concern, that'll pop right up to folks that are owners in the company. And customers basically are still placing a lot of trust in your business at this stage. They're also paying you, but along with that, there's trust that they're going to invest in the startup and you guys are going to grow together in some way. And that trust is actually a very, very important thing, I think, in the early stages of a company. But meanwhile, inside that company, things are growing and they're changing. And sometimes they're changing very, very rapidly, a lot like they were at HubSpot with the story that I told you personally before. So where does that leave the customer in all this, who's got high trust, is investing? And where does that leave the company, who's like kind of frothy and changing quickly and things are a little bit complicated, right? Well, what happens is you've actually begun then to add some of those folks to your org chart. You've added those little orange icons onto the screen here. And I've just added one for the sake of demonstration here. It's just your first kind of customer person support. And what I've seen in a lot of companies at this stage is that they tend to carve off some type of company function and hire somebody to own it. So this is a matter of hiring your first CSM or hiring your first, setup person or hiring your first, director of whatnot, support or implementation or something like that. So what's going on here then is that you've taken a function that used to be owned by everybody and you've now focused it on one buddy, on one individual person. It's kind of a key moment in that early stage company, right? Because the founding team's starting to make some key hires and they're giving up some decision control with that, but also customer experience control, right? And so the dispersal of responsibility here means a couple of things. It means now you've got potentially multiple people involved in different places, right? And that requires some coordination work. It also means that you have to draw some type of distinction, even if it's kind of a blurry line, and maybe it's not incredibly bright, but some type of distinction between the work that happens in those new people who are specialized and the old people who are unspecialized. And what I've seen tends to occur at this point in many companies is they carve off a lot of the kind of reactive, sort of quote unquote day-to-day work that's a little more support style than success style, right? And as a result, a lot of the success style work tends to live with sort of that original team, which is often founders, and then a lot of that reactive sort of, hey, I have a question in the middle of the day or in the middle of the night sometimes stuff goes to a support person who then begins to, own that and work through, a queue of issues, and they begin to specialize, right? So this is a pretty common pattern that I've seen in a bunch of companies where you carve something off, there's a dispersal of responsibility, and that forces you to make a decision about what lives where. It's a very interesting change from the founding stage of a company where customers are really coming to you and anybody they talk to feels the same. Now people begin to feel different. That's a big, big change in the customer experience, and it's an important one to understand and therefore to manage for your customers so that their experience is as good as it can be. So let's talk about the do's and don'ts then, if that's the environment that we're living in. What you do need to do here, because now you're coordinating across more than just one person, and maybe you don't even all sit together at a table. You've expanded to 15, 20 people, or you've got some remote employees or something like that. You need to begin to get communication channels under control. So I mentioned before, doing customer interactions via text message or WhatsApp is probably not the best way. At this stage, that kind of stuff really breaks down and doesn't work because you start to drop the ball on your customers. You basically have some interactions living in one place and some living in another. A lot of people at this point, this is where they say, man, we really need a CRM to figure this stuff out. The second do here is to add a touch of process very carefully. So what I mean by this is, okay, we're going to get our communication channels under control. That means the way to communicate with us, customer, is to call us at this number, not any one of these 5 numbers, but this one number, or email us for support@mycompany.com, or fill out this form or something like that, right? That's what I mean by a touch of process, just a very, very little bit to tell your customers, this is the way that we would prefer that you actually work with us. This is really important, though, because it, again, begins to build the foundation for what's to come, which has to do with making things more complicated, going more multi-channel, going more omni-channel, more multilingual, things that will happen very, very far in the future. Just by establishing the bare minimum viable process at this stage, you do yourself a lot of favors in setting expectations for your customers clearly, but you also you also lay a good set of foundations for the future so that you can grow in a more kind of predictable way as things change over time. The third thing that I think is really important here is to start thinking about self-service. If you're answering the same questions over and over, if you're finding that customers, when they get going through the implementation, are essentially running the same paths, right? You're starting to do that pattern recognition. Lean into that and start thinking about ways that you can kind of take that knowledge then and that repetition and turn it into ways for customers to service that themselves. A lot of businesses, I think, don't do this because finding the time for this is an incredible challenge when you're small, but the benefits are massive. And it can just be a simple like one-page PDF. It doesn't need to be a full blown out, knowledge base or like university, right? But thinking about ways to codify that knowledge that you have in your head from seeing the same play over and over, that's a pretty important thing at this stage to just economize your time and I think make your customers' experience a lot more smooth. All right, and then fourth on the do side, and this is really one of the first success do's in here that I'm willing to be very prescriptive about, is to trust your gut on key proactive customer success interactions, okay? So there's a lot of ways to map customer success and to think about what customers need, and there's journey mapping, and there's all these tools that we as success professionals have at our disposal. The recommendation from me to you here at this early stage is you've now had a couple of at-bats, a couple of repetitions at this customer success thing. You've seen a few customers go through your process. You've seen the places they stumble, the potholes they fall into, et cetera. You start to get an instinctual understanding of what those key moments are where you need to do the work. You need to create the energy in the system to go out to the customer and say, hey, customer, do this thing, don't do this thing, do this thing this way. There's probably like 3, 4, 5 of these for every business that are really key, really high leverage, really, if I don't do this, the customer is totally screwed type things. My recommendation at this point is to really trust your gut on those, right? Don't look at too much data. You should know what these are, and then go do those pieces of work. Make sure for every customer you're hitting those, 2, 3 things. All right. In the don't column, you may have kind of gotten this sense from just listening to me talk so far, but do not get distracted by shiny objects in the founding stage and the early stage. There's so much cool stuff out there, right? What can machine learning do for me? How is AI going to change the industry? Chatbots, those will do something, right? All of those are cool. If you don't have a kind of pretty clear straight line path to getting return for your customers out of those, now is not the time to invest energy in those shiny objects, in those new things, in those, frankly, overly sophisticated things for the scale of your business. If you have a clear path, go for it. If you don't, wait on it. Those can include things like this, right? Some process tweakathons where you try to optimize the last mile of a process, overbuilding a model, right? And trying to do some kind of complex projections. The business is going to change. The model's not going to work. Overbuilding systems and adding too much automation for a process that 3 months from now might go away entirely. Or listening to the wrong vocal customers. If your product market fit has changed over time and you've pivoted a bit, you may have some of these customers sticking around that are no longer in your target market, right? Listening to vocal customers is amazing. It's really important. And your vocal customers often become your best advocates when you make them successful. But making sure you're listening to the right ones are really, really critical. All right. And then also in the don't category at this early stage is building deep, emphasis on deep in this one, proactive success playbooks. Like I said before, trust your gut, trust your experience on the success side. Find those 2, 3, 4 moments that are really key. Go after those with great zeal. Don't go after building a playbook with great zeal, right? Hopefully you guys follow what I'm saying here on those last points on the success side of the house. All right. How we doing? We're now at the mid stage, and hopefully you've moved out of the primordial ooze of a founding stage. You're through the early stage. There's actually a business model now that's cranking in some way, and you're able to start rack mounting in customers and perhaps employees, and hopefully your revenue now is beginning to tail up a little more quickly. You've perhaps moved from a kind of linear revenue growth, right, into something that's beginning to bend the curve a little bit, and maybe you even start to go to sleep at night and say, this whole thing might actually work one of these days, right? You're really in that middle stage here. The team has gotten a lot more kind of diverse from a function standpoint. I showed a slide when I talked about the early stage, right? One to the left here, that had 4 people on it. Well, now we're like 20 to 100. There's like departments forming, right? And the muscle groups are starting to solidify. The middle stage of a company then really sets the foundation for how you're going to grow, both in terms of support and success and other stuff like sales or people operations or everything else. And through that structure, you determine kind of the capacity of your growth curve. How flexible are we going to be? How aggressive are we going to be? What path are we going to set ourselves on? So let's talk about what that means for support and success. You're really moving from a survival mode, right, where you have kind of tickets coming in or customers hitting you up. You're moving to a leadership mode, right? And that leadership mode means a couple of different things. It means you're moving from a place where you're just reacting to customer inquiries to where you're really being more proactive in terms of driving the work that you're doing and dictating this is the type of work that we want to get done. It's about changing from like going into work every day and feeling like you're just snowed under by the work that's happening to going into work every day and feeling like you have some modicum of control. So there's a bunch of things that need to change here, a bunch of things that need to happen in order to make that occur. And it can sometimes feel like a subtle shift in the business, but it's really that feeling of going from entirely reactive to much more proactive. The do here is really being intentional about what you measure. People say, oh, you can't improve something that you don't measure. You can't focus on the right thing if you're measuring the wrong thing, though. So you really need to be intentional about what you measure. If what you're measuring for your support teams is like all about response time and how fast you pick up the phone, that's going to become the thing that your CEO cares about, right? And that's going to become the measure of how well you're doing at support or success. So being intentional about what you measure and starting to pick the right numbers and shedding some light on those numbers, that will actually create a lot of energy in your business to focus on the right stuff. And if you're focusing on the wrong stuff, then you're setting a foundation for yourself at this middle stage that's really not going to give you a very good way to grow. The do here is if you don't have that self-service investment is to really start a knowledge base. And I'm using the term knowledge base here a little bit loosely, right? These are things that you know that your customers are going to need for self-service. It's knowledge base on the support side. Here's a question that we needed to, answer over and over. Here's the way to self-service that answer. It's also knowledge base on the success side. Here's something that we know customers are challenged with at this stage of the life cycle. Here's a set of integrations that people tend to need, right? Those can also be ways that you enable self-service, and you can use a knowledge base, you can use sort of a mini university. There's a lot of different ways to actually do that, but starting a knowledge base and making sure that it's actually a priority at this stage is really, really key. The other thing is just the modern customer expects to get their information in a self-service manner. So if you don't have it this way, it's going to be pretty rough on your customer experience too. All right, next up is picking your channels really deliberately, right? So when you talk about the support side of the house, say, oh, do we do phone support? Do we do email support? Do we do chat support? Stuff like that. We talk about the success side of the house. This is actually as important, picking your channels really deliberately, right? Do we interact with you quarterly? Do we interact with you monthly? Do we do QBRs that are structured? Do we do annual reviews? Right? What's sort of the channels through which your customers can expect to work with you, both in the reactive and in the proactive? And then the fourth one is thinking really carefully about specialization. I mentioned before when we talked about going from just a founding team to hiring in that first customer person, how important that first customer hire is. Well, when you think about then not just the first, but the second or the fifth or the nth, right? What tends to happen in service teams is as they grow, they specialize and mitosis occurs. You go from having a team of 10 generalists, right, to 8 generalists and 2 specialists because you've deemed that particular piece of work sufficiently important to specialize in. Thinking carefully about specialization at this mid stage is really critical. My actual recommendation to you guys here is wait as long as you can to create that specialization and keep folks in a generalist mode as long as you can. The reason to do that is so you don't kind of misstep here and specialize in something that you shouldn't be specializing in. The moment you create that specialization, you say, oh yeah, now we have somebody whose entire job it is to handle renewals or to handle this particular type of setup, right? The moment you do that, you've started to create people in your company that have an interest in making that thing work and putting a priority on it. That can be good if it's the right thing, but if it's the wrong thing, you just made a really big mistake by diverting a whole bunch of energy. And you're not giant yet, so energy diversion is a problem. You're diverting a whole bunch of energy to something that wasn't the right thing. When folks have generalist roles in success and support, they tend to kind of float to where the most urgent work is. When you specialize, you're kind of putting your thumb on the scale a bit. So only do that when you really know what you're doing and you have a very, very good sense of this is the right time to do it. We're at a breaking point. If we don't do this, something bad's going to happen. I see this particularly with renewals where people want to carve off renewals. It's actually, I think, something you want to wait on a little bit and really wait till you get to the point where it's a must do. All right. Fifth up in the do for this kind of middle stage, right, is know and have a process for those key customer success leverage points. So I said in the early stage, trust your gut, right? Well, hopefully you did. And now you know what 3 or 4 of those key points are. This is the part where you start to actually write down what that process is. And by write down, I mean like you have like a one-sheeter on how to do a successful kickoff call, how to do a successful on-site implementation, right? How to stand up a new customer effectively. This is kind of the first bit like of playbook, but it's really like baby's first success playbook. I think that what you want to do is keep this stuff relatively light until the point where you really need it. Don't over-optimize on specialization. Don't over-optimize on process for those kind of key success points. Also at this stage, a lot of companies, money is just like a constant issue. Making payroll may or may not actually be one of the top concerns, but at this point, you probably are starting to bring in some folks on the finance side that kind of know what they're doing, right? No longer do you have a part-time CFO. Now you've actually hired somebody that has some experience here and has a perspective. Oftentimes, support and service teams are the first place that person goes to kind of go after cost reduction, right? It can become a real thorn in your side as a service, success, support style leader. And look, it can be important, but think like an owner, right? And don't just take those cost reduction guardrails as must-dos, right? Evaluate the leverage that you're getting from the spend you're getting today, and how can it be better invested? So getting distracted by cost reduction as a goal in and of itself, that's measuring the wrong thing. That's not being intentional at what you measure. You should be measuring the outcomes and thinking about costs as a mechanism through which you get there. All right, second up in the don't column. Don't allow the customer team to become a buffer between company and customer. This is a similar thread than what we were pulling on earlier, right? So when you start to have this like diversification of responsibility and people that really own the customer, it's possible in certain cultures, right? Certain like corporate cultures, for the customer team then to kind of sit in between the people building the product, the people owning the company, and all those folks, and the actual customer. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if the conduit of information is very fluid through the customer team. But if the customer team becomes a buffer, right, where information isn't getting to the people building the product, people selling the product, people directing the company, then you're actually not doing your job as a success leader. You cannot become a buffer. What you want to be is a conduit, right? It's really, really important not to have the service team become this like kind of wall in between the customer and everybody else at this stage in the game, even though you're starting to do more work, even though you're probably growing and adding more people and more channels and more function over time. All right. And still, just as a reminder, is continuing not to fall prey to do-it-yourself software fixes. Again, as service teams grow, you start to get more capacity. Sometimes service teams are like, hey, I can do a little fix here. I can kind of like, edit some weird thing on the way this like Chrome plugin works, and there's a fix. No, like don't do that. Solve problems the right way at the root. Investment there at this stage still really matters, and kind of putting those spackle and paint fixes on things, they'll fall apart as you really hit your growth, which hasn't even happened yet. All right, and then lastly here on the don't is, I've said this before, but just getting too deep on the process and lifecycle journey mapping. I work at a company now, 2,500 people, hundreds in customer success. Yeah, we have deep process lifecycle journey mappings. Yeah, we use like Visio and stuff like that, and those maps are big, but that's not what you need at this stage. What you need to do is kind of find the high leverage points and go after them. Spending a whole lot of time on process and lifecycle in a conference room with your peers is not usually the time best spent. Time's better spent with your customers, hitting those points and making sure you're having good outcomes. Okay, so the growth stage here, this is like the fourth stage in my little sort of like map of startup growth here. And you guys are probably getting the picture now of where the company's at because you've got three other data points up to the left side. But at the growth stage is where growth really starts to curve upwards, right? Now you're in a pace where you're saying, oh gosh, not only do I think this thing is working, it's actually working. Here's the evidence. And oh man, we're starting to have to like hire in a lot of people. We're starting to have scale issues in our code base if you're a software company. We're starting to have, like issues that we didn't even see that we could have before. We didn't have even line of sight to back when we were an early company or a mid-stage company. What happens at this point in time is that the kind of warning I gave you earlier about being intentional about what you measure starts to become one of the biggest things. If your service team at this stage, when you're really hitting growth, is just about like answering questions and basically making customers go away, you're not providing the maximum value that you could. My recommendation to you is to pick a really business-centric metric, something that is absolutely core to the economics of the business. By the way, economics begin to matter more and more the higher up that growth curve you get. And pick something like customer lifetime value that you get really, really kind of focused on, right? And that's just, the total revenue customer generates for a company minus the acquisition costs. Seems simple. I bet a lot of you are nodding along. Yeah, we do that. Well, it turns out actually knowing these numbers really clearly when you're in a growth phase and like growth is just ripping and things are going well can actually really be tricky to get your hands around the model here. But focusing on something like customer TLV gives you a North Star as a service leader and as a service team or as an individual on a service team that you're going after. It's what you're trying to do is capture the spirit of what you had when you were at that founding or early stage, when success was everybody's job. You're trying to capture that spirit in a quantifiable form. And I think customer TLV is actually the right way to do it because every single thing you do as a business contributes to that. It's got the sales component in there in terms of acquisition, which is the minus at the end, right? It's got the revenue that's spent, and it's got the support of that revenue and the delivery of that revenue in terms of support and success. What that means then is that the org inside of like the customer team has really begun to have a number of different appendages. I mentioned before, to continue the analogy, that your muscle groups have kind of started to form, right? So you probably have a pretty fine distinction at this point, a bright distinction between support reps and somebody that feels like a CSM, right? I think that's absolutely the right thing at this point in time. The recommendation that I have on this slide, though, is to ensure that there's one person overseeing both. I've seen a lot of support teams that live in, like operations, a lot of them that live in product or even marketing, right? And there can be good reasons for those, but if your support and success teams are not housed under one leader who's focused on some kind of North Star metric like customer TLV, I would just make sure you ask yourself the question, are we doing this right? There might be good reasons for the way you're organized, but I'd raise an eyebrow at that because if you're not aligning the goals of support, the reactive function that's somewhat transactional, and success, the proactive function that doesn't have an end and is really kind of aligned with the customer on a path to growth, if you're not aligning those two under one leader, your customer is going to feel kind of these paper cuts as they move between teams. They're going to be like, man, every time I talk to support, I get like one style of answer. And every time I talk to the success, it feels different, right? And if that's the case, if that's the nature of your customer experience is disjointed and you have a lot of different touch points that feel different, right? You've lost something that made you what you are. You've lost the thing that you had in the founding stage and in the early stage that made you successful and that got you that traction as you grew. And so I think that grouping together all of the success, support, all the kind of customer-y people under one person is actually a really, really wise path to make sure that as you grow, you maintain that quality and consistency of customer experience. So a couple of do's and don'ts here. I'm a big fan of giving that one central customer leader a revenue target. I know this can be a little bit of a divisive point, and I know that a lot of, especially kind of very customer focused, especially support people, raise an eyebrow at this, but it's the way that as a team, you matter to the business, is you own something with a dollar sign or a euro sign or whatever in front of it, right? If you don't, you become this like funky operations group that just isn't, is never going to get a seat at the table. And that causes two problems. One, can't advocate for your team. And that leads to some kind of gnarly cultures inside support teams and success teams. And two, you can't advocate for your customer because you know what's going on with the customer, right? You're sitting there right in front of them. Hopefully you're not buffering, you're being a conduit, et cetera. But if you don't have a seat at that executive table as a success leader, your customers don't have a voice in there either. So it's really important, in my opinion, to give that customer leader a revenue target and make sure that that ensures a seat at the table. That can be something like revenue retention, customer retention, it could be an upsell number. I would actually argue it doesn't so much matter what it is, that the fact that it exists. All right, next up, do role support under that leader. I mentioned that before, how I think that's important so that your customer experience is not disjointed as you grow. And then third is establishing models and not just metrics. And by the way, you should open your parentheses in addition to closing them. But you should have models that start to give you some predictability in the business. I told you a story about a half an hour ago now about the way that my job at HubSpot worked as we scaled when we were in this growth phase. We got to a point where we were not scaling with the pace of our customers, and we had way more work than we could handle. Getting out from under that was incredibly painful. And that's because we had some metrics and we're like, yeah, as long as the metrics are good, we're cool, right? Well, wrong, right? We actually needed a model that was a little bit more faceted. And so this is the point where you want to kind of dust off those Excel skills, partner with those finance people who, maybe were a thorn in your side in the past, but they're really good at this type of stuff, and establish some models that give you some predictability in the business. They're going to have lines that go off 2-3 years into the future and, tend to move up into the right or whatever, right? And it might feel a little fanciful, but now is actually the time to begin doing this type of numerical planning at a pretty detailed level. So like what's your projection for the number of tickets that you're going to get in your support team a year from now? How does that translate into the number of reps you need to hire? How does that translate into your decisions to continue hiring in-house versus offshoring? Like the models will poke you to do new things with the business that you should be thinking about at this stage. And frankly, answering some harder questions about how you're going to grow successfully. Fourth up, investing in some permanent systems. So I should put permanent sort of scare quotes here. What I really mean in there is if you're still managing customers or some process off a spreadsheet, like ask yourself why. If you don't have a CRM that's actually your system of record, you're probably doing something a little funky, right? If you're organizing things out of lots and lots of Trello boards and it's actually becoming a tax on the business to manage who's managing what Trello board, right? Think about investing in some more robust systems that can grow with you. Because like I've said for the previous stages, the growth that's happening now in whatever stage you're in today, if your company is really going to grow at the pace you want it to grow, this is going to feel like nothing a year or two from now. Investing in permanent systems can help you really scale with that and not have to pay off a whole lot of infrastructure debt later on. All right, last up on the do's is understanding your customer lifecycle end to end. In prior stages, I really recommended finding those key leverage points and making sure you're attacking those in the right way. At this point, I think you have an obligation, plus enough data to succeed at it, to really understand your customer lifecycle in its totality, right? And you start to chunk those off into like, oh, this is the first 6 months kind of feel like this, the renewal feels like this, the years 1 through 3 or whatever feel like that, and you begin to develop expertise at each one of those phases, and you develop a coherent and contiguous understanding of your customer lifecycle end to end. This is the right stage to get into that kind of stuff. The don't here isn't something I've mentioned before, but is really important. Today at HubSpot, we have 2,500 employees. Probably about 600, 700 of them work in some kind of customer capacity. The culture of that team is incredibly important and very, very hard to change once you get to scale. So support teams in particular can be really victims of kind of toxic culture. Support's a really hard job. You sit there often, in front of a ticket queue, and you kind of have to deal with some gnarly stuff a lot of the time. Pay very, very close attention as a leader, as a manager, or as an individual contributor to the culture that surrounds you. Now is really the time to be the most vigilant about that culture, because like I said with systems, like I said with sort of understanding your customer, the foundations that you lay at this stage will be the things that carry you forward now. A lot of small teams, they have great culture. It's all kind of hunky-dory. As you grow, you can develop pockets of weirdness. Maybe that one little specialized team that you carved off, a year ago is starting to look a little funky. Don't ignore that. That can be really, really kind of bad in the long term. In particular, I recommend watch out for cynicism. I get it. Customer work is hard. It's a hard job. Cool. Cynicism, it's not acceptable on the floor, and it's not something that will serve you well in the long term. It's toxic, and it just bleeds into everything you do in a really gnarly way. Watch out for isolation. Is the service team being included in the right conversations? Do you have a seat at the executive table, or are you isolated from that? Do you have a way of working with the sales team and figuring out, are we bringing on the right customers? Do you have a right way of working with product? Establishing all those bridges and alignments is really, really important. And if you don't have them, it's going to lead to some cultural issues down the road. Then lastly is process over people, right? If you are really, really process driven, especially as a leader, and you're saying, okay, this is the spreadsheet for this thing and that thing, you're probably using your models a little too much and not leading the people the way they really need to be led. So yes, establish models, not just metrics, like it says on the left, but don't lead with process over people. Don't get super, super wrapped up in the way that we deliver the kickoff call. Get super, super wrapped up in the spirit that you want the people to kind of have in their heads and in their hearts when they do that kickoff call, and then give them the process as a way to understand that. All right. So the last stage here is the scale up stage. Now this is sort of a broad swath of every company that's greater than 250, but hopefully again you guys are kind of seeing how I've chunked up these stages, for the sake of explanation during today's webinar. So here we are in the last stage. At this point, your model's really working, growth is happening, right? And things are kind of cooking away. So what are the opportunities, and how do I, trying to kind of share with you guys some of my learnings, how do I even bundle up what to do at this stage? The answer here is that you want to start to tilt the way that your business thinks about your function, thinks about success, thinks about support. So there's kind of two sides to the little seesaw here on the slide, right? On the left side is the argument that serving customers costs us money. Every time we do a ticket, it's whatever number of dollars, and we want to do fewer tickets, right? On the right side is serving our customers generates revenue. And I think this is going to be a lot easier for success teams to show than support teams. But as a whole organization, a whole customer team of support and success, what you really want to do is think about the right side and make that the elevated part of the conversation, right? Yes, it costs money to do things with customers. Okay, that's a means to an end. The key here is demonstrating kind of the flywheel effects that you can get out of your customers. And there's a bunch of different reasons to do this, right? Number one, I think this is actually true. And most customer people know that there's actually massive value on the revenue side to working with your customers. But moreover, it's this, that when you're a startup, marketing is really your voice. Your ability to put a message out into the market with your marketing people and your sales people really matters. And when you're trying to bring on a new customer, that customer doesn't have that many other of your customers they can talk to when you're in that founding stage, that early stage, or that mid stage. So when you're a startup, your marketing is really your voice. But when you're a scale up, at this stage of the game, your customers are your voice. No longer do the prospects approach salespeople and sales conversations from a cold start. They've read reviews of you online. They've called up a bunch of their friends or other people that kind of know who you are. They've read your case studies, right? And all of those have to do with customers, and customers being your best marketers. And so when you think about how do we actually turn our customers into our best marketers, and how do we take advantage of the fact that when we're a startup, customers are our voice, the answer is to view the customer team as an opportunity, as a revenue generator, and as something that creates forward motion for your business, not something that's a cost drag. Having this conversation at a company is really tricky. Changing from a company that views support and success as a cost center into an opportunity is really tricky. But when you really think about the entire system dynamics of how your company grows and what it takes to win a customer, to keep a customer, and to grow a customer, the dynamics of that system change when you're a startup, from when you're a scale up. And I really think that this lesson here that we've certainly learned at HubSpot, which is a marketing company, by trade in a lot of ways, this is really at the core of it. And it's a lot of the ways in which we've been able to internally convince ourselves that, yes, customer success is an opportunity, and we see ways to invest in it to turn our customers into our best marketers. All right, so a couple of do's and don'ts. You want to create some predictability, right? You want to think about creating predictability around team growth, around management of that team growth, right? How many managers or directors, and what's the org going to look like, right? Individual performance, you start to get to a point where you're trying to manage individual performance at scale. It's a very different game than being a manager who sits with the team every day and understands what they're good at and what they're bad at. Performance management is a big deal in success and support operations both. You do want to start manage costs by automating. At this point, you know your processes. If something can be automated, you should go do it, right? Even if there's an upfront investment, now is really the time, not before. Now is the time to start thinking about, okay, we're going to be the kind of company that does process X. It's just going to be the way it is from now on. Cool. How can we manage the cost of that through automation and through some kind of introduction of scale? Don't fall prey to analysis paralysis, right? Thinking that you're at the end game will mean that you're at the end game. Analyzing everything to its kind of nth degree, that is a big waste of time when you have actual problems to go solve, actual things to go do to keep your growth really moving at this fast pace. Second thing here, don't lose sight of kind of what I call sharp edges in your customer experience. Over time, companies kind of build various forms of process and policy. Look at your terms of service. How do those affect your customers? Are there little sharp edges that they're getting caught on as they move through the life cycle? Is it something that your CSM team just knows, but actually we should fix? Yeah, that's the way it is, but maybe it shouldn't be that way. Those are all these sharp edges. And then, of course, not ignoring the voice of the customer. Once again, as you get bigger, as the success team gets bigger, it can be a buffer and an insulator from the rest of the company. Making sure that that voice of the customer is loud and in everybody's face is really important. It's an important job of success leaders. It's also an important job of people running kind of functional groups. Whether they're running an implementation kind of team or a part of a support team, making sure that the voice of the customer from every angle is loud and available is pretty key. All right. And then lastly is hesitating to move from reactive to proactive in terms of how you do your work. If you don't have a customer lifecycle that's mapped, if you don't know your key success leverage points, if you don't have some way of kind of directing customer success by this point, I'm worried about you. So make sure that you feel like you have a proactive delivery of customer experience and you're not just reacting to stuff in the lifecycle. Hopefully that goes without saying at this point though. All right. So 4 key takeaways from this presentation, then we'll get to Q&A. So in support and success, the when is just as important as the why and the how. That's what I said first, calling the right play at the right time, not over-optimizing the wrong thing early, actually very important, so that you're kind of economizing the way you spend your time to get the most bang for your buck. 2, customer people, right, like me or perhaps you, we kind of scale through process. And we're really good at it, by the way, but too much process too soon can really destroy flexibility, which you're going to need as you grow. So be really careful, right? Think about the process that you have in the early stages of growth, and don't go too crazy about process and automation early on. 3, one of the most important leaps for customer teams is to kind of shift from just reactive and like, yeah, we do the work that comes to us, to proactive. That's how you fight churn. That's how you eventually deliver better economics for your business. That's frankly how you get a better seat at the table in order to influence the way the business works for the customer. And then 4 is that leaders need to be really vigilant about centering support and success as a growth center and not a cost center. It's very easy for folks to get snowed under, especially as companies have sort of exogenous pressures in terms of finance, right? But always understanding the opportunity that lies in customer success will mean that you actually have the right angle on growth, the right angle on the future for your customers and for your business. All right. So that's it for me. I hope that was interesting. I mean, you could all see a little piece of where you are today or perhaps where you've been, either at your company or another company in the past. But I thank you guys so much for the attention, and we'll take some Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation, Michael. It was definitely a very inspiring story, and I hope others found it to be as well. We've had some questions that have come in, and I'd like to invite the audience to go ahead and submit their questions for you during this time. Let's see. So our first question that came in is, how do you go about adding onboarding specialists and renewal type of functions into the mix with customer success?
Yeah, so this is sort of touching on that sort of when and how do we specialize, right? So I think the person asking this question is probably coming from a place where they sort of have a full stack so to speak, CSM, right, where they're doing everything. And the question is then when and how do we carve off components of the life cycle, and how do we do that without destroying the customer experience or the business, right? So my take on this is you actually want to wait until the point where it's an absolutely must do, and your team is really screaming about this, right? And this may seem a little bit adversarial or adversarial leadership standpoint, but what you want to do is be very, very sure that you're making the right call. The moment you carve off implementation, your CSMs no longer see that. Now their day zero of a customer's life is whatever, 96 months into it. And you also break the relationship, you're adding a touch point. And so all the specialization stuff has a lot of cost, even that are kind of hidden, even if the benefits are very, very obvious. So for renewals, for instance, I think that's one in particular that you want to be careful about, because CSMs really enjoy delivering customer success, and the financial conversation is a harder one. But if your CSMs are owning both today, what does it do when you break that up? And now, like, there's somebody else that handles the money. Does the customer view the CSM in the same way? Is that as important to a relationship, right? So there's a lot of hidden costs to that specialization. I think you want to wait until the point at which you're absolutely like forced to do it before you make the call, so you're making the right call, because it's very hard to walk that stuff back.
Awesome. We have a second question that just came in, and it's, for customer success, what do you recommend is the best approach to divide and conquer your customer base, to strategize on how to nurture, grow, and expand?
Got it. So like a segmentation type thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is different for every business. I would advise you not to conquer your customers, but to make them successful or something like that. But I think it matters. This is kind of different for different folks. I like to think about it like you have, for any business at least, this is a generalizable way to think about it. You have, for every customer, there's a certain amount of opportunity and there's a certain amount of risk. And the goal is to really balance those two. So a way to segment your customers then based off of that philosophy could be, all right, how do we measure risk in our business? Let's say it's the amount of software revenue we have from them today, right? And you could make a bell curve of that and understand what's a high risk customer. Oh, it's a $10,000 MRR customer versus a low risk customer. It's a $1,000 MRR customer, right? And put that on a scale on sort of one side of this equation. On the other side, put opportunity, right? And there's various ways of measuring opportunity. You can measure opportunity by the size of the company, because perhaps you have products that you could sell to different people, or you pay on a per user basis. You can measure it on the size of the revenues. If you're selling to e-commerce companies and you want you want to get more of their purchases into your system to get a bigger share of that wallet, right? But kind of measuring risk and opportunity is important. And then you end up with some segments that sort of start to become somewhat obvious. Low risk, low opportunity. You want to manage them at high ratios and sort of low touch. High risk, high opportunity. Okay, we know how to deal with those, right? And there's sort of the the high risk, low opportunity, right? This maybe is something that you manage in a somewhat low touch, but you added certain programs to sort of handle that. And then once you have those four quadrants, I think you can begin to get pretty tactical about how you're actually going to deliver success for each of those segments.
Awesome. Let's see. We have a lot of questions that are coming in, so I'm trying to find a good one. How long should you continue having your team handle both support and success actively together before dividing the two teams in the early stages?
Yeah, I think this one's actually the place where I would recommend, this is a division that's going to happen pretty quickly and sort of kind of needs to happen. The trouble here is if you have one person managing support and success, so the reactive and the proactive work, all right, respectively, what happens is they'll float to the work that appears highest urgency to them. They'll come into work every day and they'll sit down at their computer and they'll look at their inbox, basically. And if they have a bunch of urgent customer requests that they need to react to, they're going to do those. That means they're going to do those before the proactive work of like, oh, I should really put together this QBR. Oh, I should really call that customer because their account is red or something like that. And so I actually think that carving off the reactive and the proactive functions is a somewhat healthy division to make. And it's one that in my experience happens pretty early on, not because people are thinking in that way that I just said, but because the systems are different. Like it's a ticket queue versus, kind of a proactive lifecycle management. And that just is a pretty different kind of type of person, and they use different systems. So we start to hire different people, I think, pretty early on for the support for success thing.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. What are your favorite metrics to track when it comes to customer success?
Ooh, baby, I got lots of them. When it comes to customer success, I think again you want to tie yourself as closely as you can to the core of the business. So now we're talking about like revenue growth, revenue retention on a dollar basis. But one I actually really like that I think is very telling is something we at HubSpot at least call customer dollar retention. It's basically your customer retention rate, right, which you can get through your churn rate and then a little bit of SaaS math, take it to 12th power and stuff. And then, but what you do is you weight it by dollars. So what that means is that a $5,000 MRR customer is 5,000 times more important than a $1 customer. And what this forces you to do is kind of handle that segmentation question that we had earlier in a pretty wise way, I think. So when you look at customer dollar retention as opposed to just churn rate, right, it's revealing of, okay, we have these big customers, but they retain terribly. And then it forces you to ask questions. Are we signing up the right customers? Are we servicing them the right way, et cetera? And it also enables you to look at your smaller customers and play a little bit more easy come, easy go there and not like obsess over every cancellation from a $5 a month customer the same way you would about a $500 a month customer. So I'm a big fan of the customer dollar retention stuff. And I feel like I need a duck and cover for what I'm about to say, but I'm actually a fan of NPS. I'm not a fan of the number. I'm a fan of the process. I think it's a really important process to sort of highlight the voice of the customer in the business.
Great. Um, One other question. So since you've built out teams, what do you look for when you're hiring CSMs?
Oh man, yeah. So I'll tell you what I don't look for. I don't look for industry expertise. I think that a lot of that's teachable, and unless you're in a really technical field, where you require an advanced degree or something, you probably don't need to look for that. I've looked for a lot of different things over the years. I don't know if I have an answer here on the perfect, CSM profile. I think in a lot of ways that tradecraft is somewhat new. I can give you a much clearer answer on the support side, by the way. But on the success side, the core thing that I've always seen really matters is empathy and just like willingness to talk to people. It's amazing how many people end up by accident in customer service, right? And that then turns into customer success if you're good at your job and all that. But at their core, they don't like talking to people. Like that's not their like happy place, right? And the CSM's job is to spend a lot of time on the outside, like CSMing, right? And you only can look at reports for so long and build so many charts. And so the people that I've seen be most successful in CSM jobs at every company, the thing they have in common is they care about people, they care about talking, they're empathetic, and a lot of the rest of the stuff can kind of go away and is pretty teachable.
Awesome. So I think that will wrap up our webinar at this time. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And also, we will be launching a survey at the end of this webinar. Will pop up, and we'd appreciate it if you could take a minute or two just to complete that so we can get your feedback. And thank you again, Michael, and thanks for joining us, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.